welcome to Spooked with Emma. I'm Emma and this is part 2 of the last 6 days. There'll be 12 parts altogether, so if you enjoy this, please subscribe so you don't miss anything. And if you can't wait for the next part, the link to buy the paperback and the ebook is in the description below. Oh, I forgot to mention there was also a step down from the bedroom back into the living room, which I forgot then too and tripped over. I slipped over completely and slammed the back of my head hard on the floor. It was horrible. It felt as though my brain moved in my skull and I could taste blood in the back of my throat. I was confused to start with and didn't really know what had happened. Then once I realised I'd slipped over and hit my head, I laid still for a little while. Even after I decided I was fine, I still didn't have the energy to get up. I started to cry and managed to wipe away my tears as they rolled down the sides of my face before they fell into my ears. I hate it when they get in your ears because you can't get them out and it's really uncomfortable, so I've always tried to avoid crying whilst lying on my back as much as possible. It was the shock more than anything that was making me cry, and the fact that there was nobody with me to care what had happened. When I got up I was still feeling wobbly, so I got a glass of water from the kitchen. The tap water was very bitter and not cold enough in the heat. I would have to remember to buy some bottled water to keep in the fridge, and sat down for a few minutes while I composed myself. Eventually I decided to pull myself together and abandon my plans to unpack, deciding that going out and exploring instead might make me feel better. I took a change of clothes out of my suitcase, splashed my tear-stained face with cold water and freshened up my makeup, then headed out. By the time I left the apartment it was after 6 PM but still almost unbelievably hot and sunny, and I started to cheer up a bit. I wasn't wearing anything special, just cut-off denim shorts, a checked shirt, wedge heels, sunglasses, and the MS bracelet I wear every day, a gold bangle covered in dark red snakeskin leather with a gold padlock charm. It was a 21st birthday gift from my mum and is a lot more tasteful and wearable than the gaudy designer jewelry she usually buys me. She did spoil it a bit by making a point of telling me that she chose it because it has Made in France engraved on the side and that that's where I was conceived, and that the colour reminded her of all the red wine she'd been drinking that night. She thought that was a hilarious story to tell me. But I still noticed quite a few admiring glances, as well as some mutters of guapa from men as I passed, one word I did know in Spanish. In London I probably wouldn't have attracted a second glance unless I was with Ben, but here the men were acting like they'd never seen a woman before. I decided I was going to like it here after all. I was surprised to find that all the shops were still open, but I decided to take advantage of the unexpected situation and see what Madrid had to offer. A lot of the shops I saw were the same as on UK high streets: Mango, Zara, Hoss and Tropier, even a Clark's shoe shop, but there were also others that were new to me. I went into El Corte Inglés, a huge department store, and bought a new handbag and a bracelet from a brand called Toes, that I assume must be Spanish because I'd never come across it before. I also picked up several pretty summer dresses and a couple of tops from Bimber and Lola, a brand I knew from London and loved, without trying any of them on, as I imagined the shops must be about to close at any minute. And a pair of white hexagonal sunglasses I wasn't sure I'd ever be brave enough to wear. I never got the chance to find out the answer to that question. When I finished shopping it was nearly 9 PM and still none of the shops showed any signs of closing, which I took as another good sign that I was going to enjoy living here. I hadn't eaten since I had lunch on the plane. In first class I'd had lamb with mint sauce, carrots and dauphinoise potatoes, plus eaten mess and a cheese course, so I wasn't especially hungry. But I didn't have any food at all in the apartment and I didn't know where people did their shopping around here. So I stopped at a restaurant I passed on the way back to the apartment. I felt a bit too intimidated to go in as the place was packed with people having lively and noisy conversations, but a waiter saw me hesitating outside and waved me in. I spent a few minutes attempting to decipher the menu before admitting defeat and pointing at some unknown item, and I ended up with a kind of chickpea pork and chorizo stew, which was actually quite delicious. I felt a bit self-conscious eating alone when everyone else seemed to be with friends or family, so I ate quickly and headed home, feeling quite proud of myself though for having eaten dinner in a restaurant not only alone but also in a foreign country. When I got back to the apartment and stepped into the living room, it took me a few seconds to take in what I was seeing. I stood there stunned and only realised when I heard them fall to the floor that I must have dropped my bags. I kept blinking, probably hoping that I was imagining it and that when I opened my eyes I would see something different. All my things were strewn around the room. From where I was standing, I could even see some of my clothes on the kitchen floor and worktop. Bottles of toiletries and makeup had been emptied onto the floor and furniture in the empty containers thrown around everywhere. The books I'd brought with me had been ripped up and the crumpled pages were scattered over the floor. I don't think I'd ever seen such a mess before in my life. I couldn't understand how this could have happened. I must have been burgled, but it didn't make any sense. I'd only been out for a few hours and it was my first day here. It didn't seem real. When I told my dad I was planning to come, he'd warned me about getting mugged on the street and told me not to wear too many obvious designer labels that would attract the attention of thieves, but it had never occurred to me that someone would break into my house. I didn't think anyone had seen me moving in. It just seemed like such bad luck, and the positive impression that I'd initially had of Madrid disappeared in an instant. The mess was just unbelievable. I was walking around in a daze, picking up crumpled clothes and hanging them over my arm when I noticed the Givenchy necklace that had been my mum's and that she gave me on my 18th birthday. It was just lying on the floor. I wondered why the thieves hadn't taken it. Even if they didn't know anything about brands, they must have been able to tell it was solid gold, and it's quite a chunky piece, which is why I never really wear it. I don't even know why I bothered bringing it with me. They would have been able to get a few €100 for it just for the weight of the gold. As I wandered around puzzling over the necklace, I noticed one of my diamond earrings on the floor too, and the more I looked around, the more I came to the conclusion that they must not have taken anything at all. I couldn't decide whether to just be pleased I hadn't lost anything or to be more worried that someone had gone to the trouble of breaking in just to make a mess. Surely if someone was going to burgle me, they would have taken things rather than just throwing them around. It didn't make any sense. I didn't know what to do. I could call the police, but what would I say to them? I wouldn't be able to explain anything in Spanish, and anyway, nothing was missing, so what would be the point? I wondered what to do and why anyone would do this, but even more than that, I wondered how they'd managed to do it. The door had still been locked when I arrived back, so how could anyone have got in and out? Unless they came from the patio, through the open window in the kitchen. But then the neighbours would surely have seen something if someone had scaled the wall and come in through my window. And how would they have got into the central patio anyway? They would have had to come in through one of the other apartments, unless it was one of the neighbours who had done it. The more I thought about it, the more I decided it was the only explanation that made any sense. It didn't even make sense, actually. But who else could have got in? Maybe they heard I was moving in and they didn't like foreign people living here. I wasn't aware of any anti-English feeling in Spain, but maybe I'd just never heard about it. I hardly ever watched the news, and I don't think I've ever bought a newspaper in my life. Or maybe one of my neighbours just happened to be crazy. That could explain why the apartment was empty. It was plausible, but I didn't like to think that I was living in an apartment block with people who hated me or were mentally ill. I didn't know which scenario was worse. I went through to the kitchen and closed the window, just in case anyone had any more ideas to terrorise me, and then I sat down on the sofa holding a bundle of crumpled clothes in my arms and sobbed for the second time that day. I sobbed for a long time, not knowing what else to do. There was nobody I knew here, nobody I could phone who could come round and make it all okay. It was bad enough being alone in a foreign country and not being able to speak the language, but having all these horrible things happen too. I couldn't even phone my parents because they were on their cruise, and I would only hear from them when they were next in port, which wouldn't be for another week at least. It was just too much. I wasn't used to handling problems like this, especially in a foreign country where I had nobody to help me. But what could I do? I couldn't exactly fly straight back to London on the day I arrived and just say I didn't like it. The whole point of coming here was to prove my independence, not to go running back to London and look like I couldn't survive for one day on my own. That's what I thought at the time anyway, although now I realise that looking a bit silly would have been infinitely preferable. Anyway, after feeling sorry for myself for a while, I started clearing up. I hung my clothes in the wardrobe to iron later, along with the new things I'd just bought, tidied everything I could salvage into piles, and put everything that was no longer usable into the bin. By the time I finished clearing up, it was after midnight, and I decided to go straight to bed and just hope the next day would be better. I didn't have any toiletries anymore, even my toothpaste had been squeezed out onto the floor, So I splashed my face with water, changed into a crumpled nightdress and got into bed. I lay there for a while, too hot to sleep, especially with no breeze coming through from the kitchen window, and listening to the unfamiliar noises from the other houses. There was a lot more noise than I was used to hearing in my Chelsea apartment, and the noise coupled with the upset of finding the apartment in such a state meant that I felt wide awake. I started to hear rain falling and the howling of strong wind, a sound I'd always found quite comforting when I was warm and cosy in bed, and it made me feel a bit better. I could almost pretend I was back in my own bed, not in a foreign country where people broke into my house for no reason. After lying awake for a bit longer, I thought maybe sitting in the kitchen and watching the rain fall would calm me down, except that when I went through to the kitchen, I looked out of the window and couldn't see any rain at all. I could still hear it, but when I looked out onto the patio, all I could see was a still peaceful night. Even the leaves on the trees were moving gently, not being whipped around like I would have expected. The only explanation I could think of was that the way that the other apartments were arranged around the patio must somehow shelter it from the wind and rain. Still, it seemed a bit odd that I could hear such a ferocious storm but couldn't see any sign of one. But what did I know about weather? I carried on wondering about it for a bit longer, then realised that I was pulling the kind of puzzled face that gives you wrinkles. My mum's refinements had convinced me that I never wanted any kind of cosmetic surgery, even Botox. I've always tried not to overdo the facial expressions. So I quickly smoothed out my forehead, told myself everything was fine, and went back to bed. I hadn't been in bed for long when I became aware of another sound, apart from the rain and the storm. It was faint at first, and I wondered whether it was just the wind, but it really did sound like someone crying. It was a kind of low moan with intermittent sobs. I almost managed to convince myself that it was coming from outside and one of the neighbours had had a fight with her husband or something, but it got louder and louder until it was undeniably coming from within the room, although of course there was nobody there. It slowly started to come even closer, so that in the end it sounded as though someone was standing right next to me, crying and sobbing. Could I be imagining it? I didn't see how. I'd had a long journey, and it had been quite an emotionally draining day, but surely not draining enough to make me imagine something like this. I wondered whether I was asleep and it was just a dream, but normally once you question a dream it disappears, and this didn't. And I was certain it wasn't coming from me, although it did sound like a woman. My eyes were open wide and I scanned the dark room to try to see where the noise was coming from, but I couldn't see anything. My whole body was rigid and I realised that I was holding my breath, not wanting to make a noise. I thought that if I could just switch on the bedside lamp it would be okay, but somehow I was too afraid even to move my arm. Afraid of what, I didn't know. All I knew was that I was more afraid than I'd ever been in my life, and I was completely overcome by it. I thought that if I didn't move or make any sound, maybe whatever was happening would stop. But it didn't. I was terrified, but at the same time I kept telling myself that there must be some kind of reasonable explanation for this, and it was ridiculous to be so scared. Surely if someone was in the house I'd have noticed, unless whoever had come in early was still there. But why would they be crying? And where could they have been hiding all this time? I wanted to ask who was there, but my throat felt so tight and no sound came out when I tried to speak. On the third attempt I heard myself asking, "Who's there?" in a strained voice. No answer came, but the wailing intensified and I started to cry again, silently, this time not brave enough even to lift my hands out from under the covers to stop the tears from dripping into my ears. My hands were shaking so much that I don't think I would have been able to control them anyway. I wanted to get out of bed and run out onto the street, but I couldn't will myself to move and I wasn't sure my legs would be able to carry me even if I found the courage to try to escape. I was trapped alone in the dark with someone or something, and I couldn't make it stop. After several terrifying hours, or maybe minutes, the noise stopped, but I was still paralysed, too scared to move in case the noise, and whatever was making the noise, came back. My eyes were still staring into the darkness, and the combination of tension and fear had brought on a pounding headache. I tried to close my eyes and sleep, but it was almost painful to close them, and every time I heard even the slightest noise, they snapped open again. I can hardly believe it was possible, but somehow I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up it was light. I was still in the same position and my body ached from being tense for so long and from my fall the previous day. I hoped, and tried to believe that maybe I had imagined it all, but my recollection was too vivid, and I knew that it had been real. I needed to get out of this house.